What we're going to discuss is called, and forgive my pronunciation, damnato memoriae. And you don't need much Latin to figure out what that means. It's the erasing from the history books, from memory, people or regimes or statues that are now out of favour. It's all the rage now, with offending statues being pulled right down the world, but as almost everything can be traced back to ancient Rome, to antiquity, it was done a long time ago and done by the Romans very, very well. Rhiannon Evans is Associate Professor in Classics and Ancient History at La Trobe University. Hi, Rhiannon, how are you?
Morning, Virginia. I'm fine, thank you.
The Romans were experts at pulling down statues of people they didn't like.
Well, they put up a lot of statues, as anyone who's been to a museum with any Roman artefacts will know, and they more defaced them rather than pulling them down. They probably pulled them down too, but in a way defacing them, like literally removing the face, is a statement in that the statue can remain there, but you've shown that you utterly disapprove of it, that this person has had their whole identity taken away from them.
And who did that?
Well, there were a couple of ways of this happening, this damnatio memoriae, which actually is a modern term. They're Latin words, but they didn't use that term. They just said that they were raising the identity, raising the face. So it could happen officially. The Senate could pass a decree, and that often happened when an unpopular regime had been ousted, usually by the murder of the emperor. And they would then say all of the coins with this person's face, all of the statues, all of their names and inscriptions should be scratched out, erased, smashed. But it didn't happen with some of the early unpopular emperors that you might be very familiar with, like Caligula and Nero. It didn't happen officially. And this is probably because it was in the interest of the emperor who came next not to do that. So there's an interesting question of whose interest it's in to get rid of this person. And because they were so unpopular, people kind of took it into their own hands to do it. So they did smash some of their statues.
And were there any consequences for this, or was this a point of raging discussion as we see now, with statues being removed or people calling for statues to be pulled down?
Well, the consequences were that you would be stopped if it wasn't official, but it seems to have happened anyway, just a huge public outcry. And actually, either way, whether it's official or not, it's not absolute, because these emperors who were officially damned, or sometimes an empress, the Empress Messalina, who was killed for basically for committing adultery, she was subject to damnatio. But statues of these people still exist, so none of it was absolute. But even if it was official. But it's kind of an interesting idea that it's slightly different to what's going on now, I think, in that it's a way of taking them out of history completely.
Yes.
And I guess the counter-argument at the moment is this is history, therefore you shouldn't get rid of it. Well, the Romans were saying in some cases, no, it should be as if this person never existed. We actually get rid of laws that they passed. We wipe their name out from an inscription and replace it with something else.
Except for that very practical response of the Romans, that they didn't actually want to get rid of what would have been in many cases a really fine piece of statuary, so they simply refaced it.
Yeah, this is one of the more entertaining aspects of this process, in that, especially with emperors, which would have been very high-quality statues, you don't actually leave that blank face, which is a comment in itself. Instead, you repurpose it and turn it into the next emperor. So you can tell, because sometimes, for example, the Emperor Domitian had quite a wide face, and it was recut into the next emperor, Nerva, with a much narrower face. But it doesn't really work, the proportions, once you just chip bits off the side and try to make it look like Nerva's features. So we've got various statues where we can tell they've just tried to morph them into somebody else. And that only works in marble, of course. Sometimes they had to completely recast the face if it was bronze. So there's a famous case with Nero, who didn't suffer official damnatio, but he was unpopular, and he had a massive statue of himself, 30 metres high, basically in the entranceway of his house. And after his death, it was recast to be the features of the sun god. So not the next emperor. The next emperor was making the point, I'm not going to have a statue like this of myself. I'll turn it into a god.
That's really fascinating. It was interesting to see on social media yesterday, a comment was made that after the wall came down, the Berlin Wall came down, and there was glasnost and perestroika in Russia. Some of the older statues there of the previous Soviet regime, they were removed, but they weren't destroyed or tumbled into the river. They were moved to a park where they are now, and you can go and see this sort of park of older, if you like, disapproved of statues, but they still exist just in one particular area. And apparently it makes an amazing place to go and visit as a tourist. It's one way of making the point about history, but still keeping the great statuary and also a part of that history too, Rhiannon.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose from my point of view, and it's much more removed because it's 2,000 years ago, but it would be a shame for us if we didn't have any statues of Caligula, because then I couldn't have sat in my art history class and be told by my art history professor that he had thin, cruel lips, which I still remember. And so, yeah, I mean, but on the other hand, I think it's interesting that clearly there was that anger for the Romans too, that sometimes it just boiled over and they wanted to make some statement, which was about, we see statues of these people everywhere and we're going to do something about it. These people shouldn't be commemorated. They shouldn't be celebrated in this way.
Well, the historian, of course, in you and in many people who revere history, would, from that point of view alone, never want to get rid of this stuff when it's so potent and important in terms of telling the story, both good and bad, of a civilization.
It is, and I guess part of that history is what happens to these statues. So,
yes.
And more than statues even, you can see it more in coins, which are everywhere and tend to last. You get coins where faces have been scratched out, and I suppose that becomes part of their history in some ways. So I can see it from both points of view. Yes, I like to know what people, or at least what certain emperors wanted to look like, but it's almost as interesting to see what the Senate or the people were then doing with that portrait. So it's nice if you can have both, I suppose.
I think it's a fascinating conversation. I love the historical perspective that you bring to it. Rhiannon, thanks so much.
Cheers, Virginia.
And we'll see you in the studio sometime soon, I hope to. Rhiannon Evans there, who's the Associate Professor in Classics and Ancient History at La Trobe University.